One quiet night, Keanu Reeves stumbled upon a struggling single dad clinging to hope by a thread. Faced with a choice to walk away or change a life forever, Keanu made a decision no one saw coming. What happened next would ripple through generations, and it all started with one silent act of kindness. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The charity event had ended an hour ago, but the echo of it lingered in Keanu's chest long after the last handshake and polite goodbye. It had been a nice gathering, full of smiling faces and warm words. Yet as he stepped out into the cool evening air, he felt strangely hollow, as if something vital had been left unsaid, something important left undone. He pulled his jacket tighter against the soft breeze and began to walk without thinking, his boots striking the cracked sidewalk in slow, steady rhythms. The town was small, tucked into the folds of a wide valley where the stars hung low and heavy above the rooftops. Most of the shops had already closed for the night. Their windows were dark, their signs swinging quietly in the breeze. Keanu liked places like this, towns that hadn't been smoothed down by the hard polish of the world's endless hurry. Towns that still knew the sound of their own heartbeats. He passed a barbershop, its striped pole frozen in the dark, a hardware store with dusty window displays, a library with posters peeling off the door. Life here was simple, maybe even a little worn, but it was real. He wasn't looking for anything, not really. But as he turned a corner, a soft glow caught the corner of his eye. A single diner, its neon sign buzzing weakly against the night sky. It was the only place still open, a small patch of light and warmth in an otherwise sleeping town. Without hesitation, Keanu crossed the street, hands deep in his jacket pockets, and pushed open the diner door. The small bell above it jingled, soft and unassuming. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and something fried. The booth cushions were cracked, the counter was scratched from decades of elbows and coffee cups, but the place had a kind of tired dignity to it, like it had weathered every storm the town had thrown its way. Keanu nodded politely to the elderly woman behind the counter, who offered a kind but distracted smile, and made his way to a booth in the back, away from the handful of other late-night patrons. He wanted a cup of coffee, maybe a few quiet minutes to sort out the strange heaviness pressing against his ribs. But as he settled into the worn seat and wrapped his hands around the chipped ceramic mug the woman brought him, his eyes caught something in the far corner of the room, and everything changed. In the corner booth near the window sat a man, mid-30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a faded apron over jeans and a t-shirt. His hair was mussed, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion that ran deeper than a long shift could explain. Across from him, a little girl sat with a workbook spread out in front of her, her pencil tapping thoughtfully against her lip. She was no older than 8 or 9, her sneakers swinging a few inches above the floor. The man, Jake, as Keanu would later learn, kept one eye on the counter, where orders piled up, and the other on the girl. Every few minutes he would duck back to the kitchen, deliver plates to customers, wipe down a table. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, he would rush back to her side, kneel down, point to a math problem, murmur encouragements. There was no grand gesture in it, no pity, no tired sighs, just love, worn around the edges maybe, but fierce and steady as a lighthouse. Keanu watched, the coffee forgotten in his hand. He saw Jake sneak an extra sandwich from the kitchen and slide it across the table to her, pretending it was part of the order. He saw the girl beam at him like he had just handed her a feast fit for a queen. He saw the way Jake gently tugged the sleeves of her sweater over her thin wrists when she shivered, the way he brushed a strand of hair behind her ear while pretending to straighten the sugar packets on the table. It was the smallest acts that cracked Keanu's heart wide open. Here was a man holding his world together with nothing but tired hands and stubborn hope, and nobody in that diner seemed to notice. Keanu felt something stir deep inside him, something that had nothing to do with charity galas or signed checks. It was a simple truth he had known all his life, one that was too easy to forget in the noise of success. Sometimes, the real heroes didn't stand on stages. Sometimes they just showed up, every single day, and loved, even when it broke them. Keanu sat back, his hands loose around the coffee cup, and kept watching. Something inside him whispered that he had not found this place by accident. Something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, he was meant to be here tonight. The minutes slipped by, marked only by the slow ticking of an old clock on the wall. Jake moved with the practiced rhythm of a man who had learned to do 3 things at once: wash dishes, help with homework, smile through exhaustion. No customers clapped him on the back. No awards waited for him at the end of his shift. But the girl's face shone with every stolen moment of attention he gave her. When she finished her homework, Jake sat down with her for just a few precious minutes, pulling a crumpled piece of notebook paper from his back pocket. Keanu watched as Jake unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases. Drawn on the paper was a simple dream. Childish sketches of a small house, a yard with a tire swing, a dog curled up on a porch. Jake pointed at each part, whispering something that made his daughter giggle and nod. Maybe someday, he was saying. Maybe someday, if they just held on a little longer. Keanu felt something sting behind his eyes. He set down his coffee cup, untouched, and reached slowly into his jacket pocket, where he always kept a small leather wallet. Inside, folded between receipts and worn-out bills, was something he rarely touched anymore. A reminder of the boy he used to be. The boy who had once needed someone to believe, just like Jake needed someone to believe now. Keanu didn't move immediately. He stayed there, soaking in the sight of a father trying, a daughter trusting, and a dream fragile as paper but burning bright as any star. The diner door creaked quietly as another customer entered, breaking the spell. Keanu blinked, shook himself, and rose from his booth, leaving a few bills for the coffee he never drank. But he didn't leave empty-handed. He left carrying something he hadn't realized he was looking for. A reminder. Good goal. As he stepped toward the counter to settle his bill, he slid something else under his empty plate. Something Jake would not find until much later. And with that, Keanu stepped out into the night, the soft jingle of the bell marking his exit. Behind him, the diner glowed like a tiny ember in the vast dark. Ahead of him, the stars stretched wide and silent across the sky. Jake moved like a man balancing the weight of the world in his hands. Keanu leaned unobtrusively against the diner counter, pretending to glance at a menu taped to the wall, but his attention was locked onto the man in the apron. Jake carried a stack of dishes to the sink, his back bent just a little too far forward, his steps dragging more than they should have for someone so young. But it was his eyes that caught Keanu's heart the most. There was a tiredness there, yes, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of long nights and heavier days. But woven into that exhaustion was something else, too. Something stronger, a quiet fire that had refused, even after everything, to burn out. Jake's gaze flicked constantly toward the corner booth where his daughter Emily sat hunched over her workbook, chewing the end of her pencil. Every few minutes, Jake would wipe his hands on his apron and stride over to her, crouching down so he could see her work. "You're getting it, kiddo," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "One step at a time, just like climbing a mountain." Emily giggled and nodded, her small shoulders straightening proudly. Keanu watched the exchange, feeling an unexpected lump rising in his throat. It was easy to miss scenes like this. Easy to walk by, to mistake survival for defeat, to overlook the tiny victories being won in the corners of the world. But Keanu knew better. He knew the real battles were often fought in silence. In diners and bus stops and late-night living rooms where no crowds gathered to cheer. Jake patted Emily's head before hurrying back to the counter as the order bell dinged again. Even as he hustled plates and wiped down tables, his focus never truly left her. It was a dance, Keanu realized. A careful, exhausting dance between duty and devotion, between survival and love. And Jake was holding the rhythm, with hands rough from work, but steady with purpose. As the evening wore on, more customers trickled in, a few regulars, some travelers like Keanu, and a pair of teenagers laughing too loudly near the jukebox. The diner buzzed with low, comfortable noise. Jake kept moving. He balanced trays on one arm while refilling coffee cups with the other. He laughed at bad jokes, apologized for slow service, and somehow managed to keep every plate spinning without letting anything crash. But every spare second belonged to Emily. When she looked frustrated with a math problem, Jake would mime ridiculous thinking faces until she giggled again. When she yawned behind her tiny hand, he snuck over with a blanket from behind the counter, tucking it around her shoulders with a wink. The tiredness never left his face, but neither did the love. It clung to him the way dust clings to old books, the way light clings to the last hours of a fading day. Keanu sat quietly, letting the details carve themselves into his heart. The frayed laces of Jake's sneakers, the worn patches on his jeans, the way his hands shook just slightly when he thought no one was watching. Jake was carrying too much, yet somehow he was still carrying it. And somewhere inside Keanu, something shifted. Something old, something rooted in memories of his own childhood, of scraped-together meals and stolen moments of safety, memories of kindness offered with empty pockets but full hearts. Keanu sipped his coffee slowly, the taste secondary to the understanding unfolding in front of him. He wasn't here by accident. He wasn't here just to pass time. He had stumbled into a life still fighting for a future, and some part of him knew he was meant to witness it, maybe even to be part of it. Jake took a rare break toward the end of the night, dropping heavily into the seat across from Emily. He glanced at the clock on the wall and let out a soft sigh. "Bedtime, kiddo," he said, ruffling her hair. "Even for superheroes." Emily whined half-heartedly, but packed up her things without argument. Keanu saw the way she looked at her father, with unshakable trust. To her, he was the whole world. A hero not because he had conquered mountains, but because he stayed, because he showed up, even when the odds said he shouldn't have been able to. Jake rose from the booth and stretched, his body moving like someone twice his age. He tucked Emily's worn backpack under his arm, balanced a tray of dirty dishes on the other, and disappeared into the kitchen, with a soft hum of an old song under his breath. Keanu watched him go, his chest tightening. This was what real courage looked like. Not grand declarations or dramatic rescues. Just love, lived fiercely and stubbornly, in the small, unseen moments. Keanu finished his coffee and placed a few bills under his cup, but his mind was already working, already planning. He wouldn't leave things as they were. Not this time. Something needed to be done. Something quiet. Something real. As Jake re-emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, Keanu caught his eye just briefly, a simple nod of acknowledgement from one man to another. A silent promise. Then Keanu slipped out into the night, unnoticed, the diner door swinging shut behind him with a soft chime. But the decision had already been made. Jake and Emily's story was about to change, and they would never even know who had helped write the next chapter. The night air was cool against Keanu's skin as he made his way back to his rental car, the distant buzz of the diner's neon sign still faint behind him. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, not starting the engine, staring through the windshield at the quiet street ahead. He could not shake the image of Jake and Emily from his mind. It had been such a small scene to anyone passing by, easily missed. A tired man helping his daughter with homework while juggling late-night shifts at a rundown diner. But to Keanu, it had felt like witnessing something sacred. Real strength wasn't loud, he thought. Real sacrifice didn't announce itself. Some people were changing the world one invisible act at a time, and no one ever knew their names. Keanu pulled out his phone and opened an anonymous profile he kept on a private forum connected to a small foundation he supported quietly. It was a place where people shared reflections, posted questions, and lifted each other up without judgment or the noise of fame. Without overthinking it, he typed, "Have you ever met someone who quietly inspired you just by how they lived?" He stared at the screen for a few seconds, then hit post. He didn't mention Jake. He didn't explain the diner. He just let the question breathe into the world. Almost immediately, notifications began to trickle in. The first comment was simple: "My grandmother. She raised 5 kids alone after my grandfather died, never once complaining. She taught me kindness doesn't need to shout to be strong." Keanu smiled softly. Another comment appeared. "High school janitor who used to leave encouraging notes taped to my locker when he noticed I was struggling. I never knew it was him until years later." He scrawled slowly, letting each story settle into him. A woman wrote about a neighbor who, after losing his wife, spent every Saturday fixing up broken bikes for kids in their rundown neighborhood, asking for nothing in return. A young man shared how his former boss once kept the office open late so he would have a warm place to stay after losing his apartment, never mentioning it to anyone. Each story was a small flame, glowing quietly against the backdrop of a world that often missed its brightest lights. Keanu rested his head against the car seat, feeling a lump rise again in his throat. These were the real heroes, he thought. The ones who didn't get statues. The ones who didn't trend online. The ones who showed up anyway. As the minutes passed, the number of comments grew. One after another, people poured their memories into the thread like water finding its way through cracks. Some stories were only a few words long. Others spilled into long paragraphs, thick with years of gratitude. My third-grade teacher who brought extra snacks for kids who didn't have lunch and pretended it was extra so we wouldn't feel ashamed. A woman on the bus who sat with me when I was crying and didn't ask me what was wrong. She just sat and let me not be alone. The night nurse who held my father's hand when none of us could get there in time. She stayed hours after her shift so he wouldn't pass alone. Each story hit differently, but they all carried the same invisible thread. A quiet belief in others, a refusal to let someone walk through the world unseen. Keanu read through the night, his phone screen glowing against the dark interior of the car. He didn't reply to the comments. He didn't insert himself into their moments. He simply bore witness, because sometimes that was the most powerful thing you could do. He thought again about Jake and Emily, about the way Jake had smiled despite the exhaustion, about the way he had tucked Emily's hair behind her ear with the same tenderness a king might give a crown. Jake didn't know he was inspiring anyone. He wasn't trying to. He was just living, choosing love over bitterness, choosing effort over despair, choosing hope even when no one else was looking. Keanu locked the phone and set it down on the passenger seat. A part of him ached to do more, to rush back into that diner and tell Jake that he was seen, that his fight mattered. But another part of him understood something deeper. The best gifts are the ones given without spotlight or obligation. The best encouragements are the ones whispered, not shouted. And Jake deserved the dignity of never knowing how many hearts his quiet strength would touch. Keanu leaned back against the headrest, letting the hum of the town settle into his bones. Tomorrow, he would begin to set things in motion. Tomorrow, the first threads of a new beginning would weave themselves through Jake and Emily's lives, unseen but strong. But for tonight, Keanu allowed himself to sit in the stillness, to remember that the world, for all its noise and chaos, was still filled with miracles. And not the loud kind, not the grand televised kind, the kind that bloomed in worn diners and tired smiles, the kind that traveled silently from one life to another, carrying hope where it was needed most. He closed his eyes for a moment and breathed in the night. And somewhere in that dark, silent town, the seeds of something extraordinary had already begun to grow. The next evening, Keanu found himself drawn back to the diner almost without thinking. He entered quietly, the same soft jingle of the door marking his arrival. No one paid him much attention, just another tired traveler stopping in for a cup of coffee. He slipped into the same booth as before, nodding politely to the elderly woman at the counter, and ordered a coffee he barely touched. His real focus was on the corner booth near the window. Jake was there, just as before, apron tied loosely around his waist, moving between clearing tables and checking on Emily. His motions were fluid, practiced, but exhaustion tugged at the corners of his mouth. Yet it was the little moments that captured Keanu's attention, the almost invisible acts of love that threaded through everything Jake did. When the cook in the back wasn't looking, Jake slipped a few extra fries onto Emily's plate. He set them down with a casual shrug, pretending it was no big deal. Emily's face lit up like he had just gifted her a treasure. Keanu smiled into his coffee. Later, as Emily worked through a tangle of homework problems, Jake hovered nearby. Every few minutes, he would brush her hair back behind her ear without saying a word, his rough fingers moving with a gentleness that made Keanu's chest ache. It wasn't just affection. It was a promise that no matter how broken the world got outside those diner walls, inside this tiny booth, she would always be safe. And then there was the notebook. Keanu spotted it when Jake thought no one was looking. A battered old, spiral-bound thing, edges frayed, cover peeling. Jake pulled it from the back pocket of his jeans when he passed the kitchen doorway, glancing at it quickly before tucking it away again. Keanu caught a glimpse of a rough sketch inside. A small house, a yard, a crooked tree. Dreams, held close, like a secret, protected like something sacred. Jake moved back to the counter, calling out a new order with a voice that somehow still found the energy to be kind. Keanu watched, feeling the full weight of quiet sacrifice settle into the room like a second gravity. Jake wasn't just working for tips or survival. He was building something invisible, brick by brick, a future, a home, a belief that things could get better, even if the world gave him no reason to believe it. Keanu wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and stayed where he was, unseen, soaking in the truth of it. The real heroes didn't wear capes. They wore aprons. They wore tired smiles. They carried notebooks full of dreams. And somehow, they kept moving forward. The diner slowly emptied as the night wore on. A few regulars finished their late dinners and slipped out into the darkness. The teenagers by the jukebox finally grew tired of their game and wandered off, leaving only the fading echo of their laughter behind. Jake moved a little slower now, his feet dragging just slightly as he cleared plates and wiped down tables. But every time he passed by Emily's booth, something in him straightened. Some invisible thread pulled him upright again. Emily worked steadily, her small brow furrowed in concentration over her homework. Every so often she would glance up to check on Jake, her face brightening when their eyes met. They were each other's anchor in a world that had offered them too few. Keanu watched as Jake paused by her booth, setting down a fresh glass of water with a smile. "You're almost there, kiddo," Jake said, ruffling her hair. "Finish strong." Emily nodded fiercely, scribbling answers with renewed determination. Keanu caught the moment when Jake turned away, pulling the battered notebook from his pocket again. This time, he flipped it open fully, staring down at its worn pages. Keanu could see faint sketches across them, dreams too big to say out loud, plans for a better life, a backyard with a tire swing, a job with hours that let him be home for dinner, a school where Emily would never have to explain why her clothes were a little too worn or why her lunches were a little too small. Jake traced the edge of one drawing with his thumb before snapping the notebook shut and stuffing it back into his pocket. He didn't see Keanu watching. He didn't see the way the sight of it gripped at Keanu's heart. Jake didn't know anyone noticed. But Keanu did. He saw every unspoken hope folded into that notebook. every sacrifice, tucked into late-night shifts and early mornings. Every quiet prayer offered up not for riches or fame, but for something far simpler and infinitely more precious. A life where Emily could simply be a kid. Keanu sat back in his booth, his coffee long gone cold, and thought about how many Jakes there were in the world. How many fathers, mothers, grandparents, and guardians fought battles every day without fanfare. How many small dreams flickered quietly in the shadows, waiting for someone to believe in them. He realized, sitting there, that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for someone wasn't to rescue them or fix everything. Sometimes it was simply to see them, to bear witness to their fight, to believe in their unseen dreams. Jake wiped down another table, smiling tiredly when Emily waved her finished homework at him triumphantly. Keanu felt a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. This was not a story about saving. It was the story about standing beside, and sometimes that made all the difference. Jake gathered Emily's books and tucked them gently into her backpack, handling the worn zippers with the same care someone else might reserve for fragile glass. "Ready to head home, superstar?" he asked, voice low and warm. "Yep." Emily nodded, stifling a yawn with the back of her hand. Jake laughed softly and swung her backpack over one shoulder, the other hand free to ruffle her hair one last time. Keanu stayed seated, letting the moment unfold without interference. He noticed the details others might miss. The way Jake glanced at the register and hesitated before pulling out a crumpled few dollars for their meal. The way he counted the coins carefully, as if every cent was a battle fought and won. The way he still left a tip, even when it clearly stretched him thin. Character, Keanu thought, was built in the moments no one ever saw. Jake's dignity wasn't worn like armor. It was sewn into his every action, stitched together by love and a fierce refusal to let circumstances dictate who he became. Keanu's chest tightened as he watched them move toward the door, Jake holding it open for Emily with a small, theatrical bow that made her giggle as she skipped outside. Before following her, Jake paused for just a second. He turned back toward the empty diner, his gaze sweeping the place like he was memorizing it. Like he understood that even in its cracked booths and flickering lights, it had sheltered him, had given him the space to dream a little longer. Keanu stayed hidden in the shadow of his booth, heart full to the brim, with everything he could not say. As Jake disappeared into the night after his daughter, Keanu exhaled slowly. Tonight he had seen something that most people rushed past every day. Love, written in the small, persistent acts of an ordinary man. Hope scribbled on worn notebook pages. Dreams strong enough to survive the long winters of the world's indifference. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a scrap of paper and a pen. He wrote something quickly, folding it once, twice, 3 times. Then he slid it under the empty coffee cup Jake had left behind, pressing it down with a small smile. A note, simple and sure, waiting to be found. Not a reward, not charity, just a reminder that somewhere, someone had seen, someone had noticed, and someone believed that quiet dreams, no matter how small or hidden, deserved to bloom. Keanu gathered his jacket and stepped into the cool night, the door jingling once behind him. Far ahead, he caught a glimpse of Jake lifting Emily into his arms and spinning her gently under the streetlights. Keanu smiled softly. Little moments of love. That was where the real miracles lived. Keanu stayed seated for a few minutes after Jake and Emily disappeared into the night. The diner had fallen into a deep hush. Only the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of silverware being gathered from the tables filled the space. The old woman behind the counter wiped down the surface absent-mindedly, humming a song too soft to recognize. Keanu reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulling out a plain, thick envelope he had prepared earlier that day, almost without realizing why. Inside it was enough to cover several months of rent for someone like Jake. Enough to breathe again. Enough to buy time, not to escape responsibility, but to allow dreams to catch up to hard work. Keanu ran his thumb lightly over the edge of the envelope, thinking carefully. He could have handed it to Jake directly. He could have made a speech, explained who he was, offered connections, offered more. But that was never the point. Kindness that demanded gratitude wasn't kindness at all. It was a transaction, and Jake deserved better than that. Keanu reached into his pocket for a pen and scrawled 4 words on the front of the envelope in simple block letters. Keep dreaming. You are seen. He tucked the envelope securely under his empty coffee cup, making sure it would be found when the table was cleared, but not before. Then he slid out of the booth, shrugging on his jacket with a quiet finality. The diner door creaked slightly as he pushed it open, the small bell overhead giving one last soft jingle. Keanu stepped into the cool night air, pulling his cap lower over his eyes. Behind him, the diner's warm lights spilled out onto the empty sidewalk, but he didn't look back. Some stories didn't need an audience. Some miracles didn't need witnesses. They only needed to be given freely and left to bloom in their own time. The street was nearly empty, save for a few stray cats darting between garbage bins and the low hum of a distant radio crackling from an upstairs window. Keanu kept his pace slow, the cool night air threading through his jacket, calming the heaviness in his chest. Every step away from the diner was a deliberate choice to leave the gesture anonymous. He thought about how easily he could have made it about himself, about how tempting it would have been to tell Jake who he was and what he had done. But it would have taken something sacred and made it small. Tonight wasn't about being seen. It was about seeing. He passed the old library he had noticed earlier, its windows dark now, its doorway littered with flyers curling from dampness. Somewhere beyond it, Keanu could still faintly hear laughter, maybe from a house where the lights still burned late into the night. The world kept moving, indifferent to small miracles. But Keanu knew the truth. The world changed in these moments, not in the headlines, not in ceremonies, in the silent act of one person choosing to believe in another. He imagined Jake returning to the table, tired, ready to close up, finding the envelope tucked beneath the cup. The confusion first, then the disbelief, then, maybe, the quiet cracking open of hope, where despair had been rooted for too long. Keanu allowed himself a small smile. It would not fix everything. It wasn't meant to. But sometimes, even one breath of relief was enough to save a life. Sometimes, knowing someone had noticed was enough to gather the strength to keep going. He reached the corner where the streetlights grew fewer and paused for a moment under the canopy of stars. He breathed in the crisp night air, feeling it settle deep into his bones. Tomorrow would come with its own storms. Bills would still need to be paid, challengers would still rise. But somewhere, in a diner warmed by the soft glow of faith and effort, a man and his daughter would sleep a little easier, dream a little bigger, hold on a little longer. And that, Keanu thought, was enough. Keanu's footsteps grew softer as he moved farther away from the diner, the town around him folding into a hush broken only by the sighing wind. He passed a small park, its swings creaking gently even though no one was there. Across the street, an old gas station sat, dark and empty, its sign missing a few letters but still stubbornly standing. The town, for all its tiredness, still held a stubborn kind of beauty, a resilience that mirrored what he had seen in Jake's face. At the next corner, Keanu slowed and turned once, just briefly. From this distance, the diner looked like a simple ember against the darkness, a soft heartbeat still pulsing. He imagined Jake locking the doors after the last customers left, wiping down the counters, checking on Emily one last time before they headed home together. He imagined Jake finding the envelope, the moment of hesitation, the way his hands would tremble, not sure if he should hope or be afraid. And then, the words written in simple black ink catching his eye. Keep dreaming. You are seen. Keanu hoped he would understand it was not charity. It was recognition. It was the world, through one quiet messenger, whispering back, "You are not invisible. Your fight matters. Your love matters. You matter." Keanu tucked his hands deeper into his jacket pockets and continued walking, feeling lighter with every step. Tonight, he had planted a seed, not one that would sprout overnight, but one that, given time and a little faith, might bloom into something stronger than either he or Jake could yet imagine. Well, the real kind. The kind that survives even when no one claps for it. As he disappeared down the empty road, the sky opened wider above him. A blanket of stars stretched across the heavens. He let himself smile again, small and real. Not for recognition, not for pride, but because somewhere in a small town, a man who refused to quit and a little girl who still dared to dream were about to be reminded that miracles still lived in the world. Quiet miracles, unseen perhaps, but no less real for it. And sometimes, Keanu thought as he walked into the night, sometimes that was enough to change everything. The diner smelled like coffee and lemon soap when Jake pushed through the back door the next morning, Emily trailing sleepily behind him. It was earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to crack the sky open, painting the horizon with soft, golden light. The streets were still empty, the town holding its breath before the start of a new day. Jake dropped Emily's backpack onto their usual corner booth and grabbed a rag from the counter, moving by instinct. He had slept little, his body still heavy with exhaustion from the night before. But there was no room for slow mornings in their lives. Bills didn't wait. Rent didn't wait. He moved toward the tables, cleaning up the remnants of last night's late shift, his mind already running through a list of tasks. It wasn't until he reached the booth where the stranger had sat that he noticed the coffee cup turned upside down, and the envelope pinned beneath it. Jake frowned, setting the rag aside. He reached out, hesitating for just a second before lifting the cup and picking up the envelope. It was thick, heavily so, and written across the front in simple black ink were 4 words: "Keep dreaming. You are seen." Jake's heart thudded once, hard and loud. He glanced around the diner, as if expecting someone to step out from the shadows and claim it, to shout that it was a mistake. But the place was empty. Just him. Just Emily. Just the sound of the old refrigerator humming from the kitchen. His hands shook slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a stack of bills. More money than Jake had seen in one place in years. Enough to cover months of rent. Enough to pay off overdue bills. Enough to put real groceries on the table, not just ramen noodles and canned soup. Jake's knees buckled, and he dropped heavily into the nearest chair. The envelope slid from his hands and landed on the table with a soft thud. For a long moment, he just stared at it, breathing hard, as if the mere sight of it might wake him from some cruel dream. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. They fought. They screamed. They lost. But gifts? Miracles? Those belonged to other stories. Other life. Jake ran a hand through his hair, blinking back the sudden sting in his eyes. Emily's voice broke the silence. "Daddy?" she said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Are you okay?" Jake swallowed hard and forced a smile he didn't feel. Yet. "Yeah, kiddo," he said, voice rough. "Just surprised." He closed the envelope carefully, like it might vanish if he looked away. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his worn jacket, pulling it tight against his chest. Then he rose slowly and carried the rag back to the counter, wiping with hands that still trembled. The world had shifted under his feet, and he didn't know yet whether it was safe to believe. Jake moved on autopilot through the rest of the early morning, setting up the coffee pots, checking the supplies, wiping the already clean counters. His mind wasn't on the work. It was on the envelope, burning against his chest like a second heartbeat. The what-ifs spun in his mind faster than he could catch them. What if it was a mistake? What if someone came back, demanding it be returned? Enter. What if it was some cruel joke he didn't understand yet? He poured coffee for the first few regulars who trickled in, answering greetings with automatic smiles. But every time he reached into his pocket for a pen or a notepad, his fingers brushed against the envelope, and the disbelief flared fresh all over again. He didn't know what to do with a miracle. Jake had spent so long building walls against disappointment that now, faced with a door cracked open by kindness, he didn't know how to walk through it. Emily colored quietly at the counter, oblivious to the storm inside her father. Every so often, she would glance up at him and flash a quick grin before returning to her drawing. Jake clung to those glances like lifelines. The door to the kitchen swung open, and Sister Marge, the diner's owner, shuffled out with a crate of potatoes. She was a wiry woman in her late 60s, with hair always tucked under a handkerchief, and a sharp eye that missed nothing. She set the crate down with a grunt and wiped her hands on her apron. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, peering at Jake over the rims of her glasses. Jake hesitated. Then, unable to carry it alone a second longer, he pulled the envelope from his jacket and laid it carefully on the counter. Sister Marge's eyes widened slightly. He didn't need to explain. She picked it up, weighed it in her hands, then looked at him. Really looked at him. Jake waited for her to tell him he had to give it back, that it wasn't right, that nothing in life came for free. But Sister Marge just smiled, slow and knowing. "Maybe," she said, tapping the envelope against her palm. "It's just your time for something good, honey." Jake blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of it. No suspicion, no cynicism, just a quiet certainty that sometimes grace showed up unannounced, and you didn't need to question it. "You've earned it," Sister Marge added, nodding toward Emily without needing to say more. "Take it, use it, and don't you dare waste time feeling guilty about it." Jake let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He folded the envelope back into his jacket and pulled Emily into his arms, hugging her tightly against him. Maybe it was okay to accept good things without suspicion. Maybe, for once, it was okay to believe. Later that afternoon, after the lunch rush had thinned out, Jake found a quiet moment in the kitchen. The envelope still felt heavy in his jacket pocket, but the weight had shifted. It no longer felt like something foreign or dangerous. It felt like possibility. He sat at the small metal table tucked into the back corner of the kitchen. Emily curled up nearby with a coloring book Sister Marge had dug out from a forgotten drawer. Jake pulled the envelope out again and ran his fingers across the words written on the front. "Keep dreaming. You are seen." He thought about what it meant to be seen, not as a failure, not as someone barely holding the pieces together, but as someone fighting, someone loving, someone worth believing in. He opened the envelope once more, not to count the money, but to absorb the reality of it. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake could imagine paying off the overdue electric bill. He could imagine buying Emily a brand new backpack for school instead of patching up the old one with duct tape. He could imagine groceries stacked high in their little kitchen, fresh fruit and real milk instead of powdered substitutes. He could imagine breathing. Jake wiped at his eyes quickly when he felt the sting of emotion return. He couldn't fall apart now, not when there was so much to be done. He tucked the envelope carefully into the center of Emily's coloring book, hiding it between the pages where he knew it would be safe. Then he stood, rolling his shoulders back. Hope was heavy too, he realized, but it was a burden he was more than willing to carry. He caught Sister Marge's eye through the kitchen window. She gave him a wink and a nod, then turned back to scolding one of the teenage waiters for stacking the plates wrong. Jake chuckled under his breath. It would be easy to let fear steal this moment, easy to tell himself it was too good to be true. But Emily deserved better than that. She deserved a father who could believe in good things, even when he was afraid. Jake moved through the rest of the day with a new steadiness to his step. It wasn't confidence exactly. It was something quieter, but deeper. It was the beginning of trust. Not in luck, not in miracles, but in the idea that maybe, just maybe, the world sometimes met you halfway when you refused to give up. As the evening sun slanted golden through the diner windows, Jake glanced over at Emily, still lost in her colorful drawings. He smiled to himself. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for tonight, they had enough. Enough to dream, enough to hope, enough to believe that better days were not just stories told to other people. They were coming for them, too. And that was a ripple strong enough to change everything. Later that night, Keanu sat once again in the quiet of his rental car. The small town stretched out silent beyond the windshield. The events of the day weighed differently now. He thought about Jake, finding the envelope, about the ripple it would cause in his life, small at first, then maybe larger than anyone could predict. He thought about Emily's smile, about the way a simple kindness could realign the course of a future without ever demanding thanks. Keanu opened the anonymous profile on the private forum once more. He typed slowly, thinking carefully about every word. If someone gave you a second chance without asking for anything, what would you do with it? He posted the question without fanfare, closed his eyes, and waited. The first response appeared within minutes. I would go back to school. I never finished because I had to work to help my family. If someone believed in me enough to give me a second chance, I would walk into that classroom and finally finish what I started. Another followed. I would forgive myself. Start over. Try to live the life my sister always believed I deserved before she passed away. More responses came, each one a glimpse into lives quietly carrying hope despite everything. One woman wrote about the stranger who had paid her grocery bill when she was newly single with 3 kids and no job. She had used that act of kindness to rebuild her life, one day at a time, eventually starting a food pantry to help others. A young man shared that after his father abandoned the family, a coach had covered his soccer fees without ever telling him. That coach's faith had kept him in school, eventually leading him to a scholarship he never thought he could earn. There were stories of teachers who stayed after school to help struggling kids. Stories of neighbors who dropped off food during hard winters without ever knocking on the door. Stories of small hands lifting heavy burdens in ways that shaped entire lives. Keanu read each one slowly, letting the words settle deep inside him. Every story was a reminder that goodness, real goodness, rarely shouted its name. It moved quietly. It worked in the shadows. It planted seeds in soil too often overlooked, trusting that someday, somehow, the roots would catch. He scrolled further, heart full with the sheer resilience of it all. Not everyone who received a second chance knew what to do with it right away. Some stumbled, some fell again, but even those stories carried a beauty all their own. The beauty of trying, of honoring the gift by refusing to give up. Keanu thought about Jake again, about the notebook full of dreams tucked into the pocket of a worn jacket. Sometimes, he realized, a second chance was not a rescue. It was a reminder, a whisper in the darkness that said, you can still become. And that whisper, once heard, could change everything. As the comment thread grew longer, Keanu noticed something else happening. The people responding weren't just sharing their own stories, they were lifting each other up. One man wrote about losing his way after prison, only to have a stranger offer him his first real job. Another woman replied beneath his story, encouraging him, reminding him that redemption was a journey and that his past did not define his worth. Someone else shared how, after surviving a terrible accident, a nurse had stayed by their side for months without ever expecting recognition. They wrote, "She sat with me on the worst nights. She didn't have to, but because she did, I believed I was still human." Replies flooded in, not just with hearts and likes, but with stories of how reading these words gave others hope too. The thread became more than just reflections. It became proof. Proof that unseen kindness still lived everywhere. Proof that second chances didn't always come with fanfare, but when they did, They could echo through lives like music no one could ever silence. Keanu read a comment that made him pause longer than the others. It said, "Sometimes the second chance isn't for you, it's for the people you haven't helped yet." He let that sink in. How many lives, he wondered, had Jake and Emily yet to touch? How many dreams would be born because someone once helped Jake believe in his own again? Keanu thought about the ripple effect, how one moment of being seen could light a fire that burned quietly, invisibly for years. He scrolled down to another comment that simply read, "Thank you for being the reason I stayed one more day." It wasn't directed at him, but it could have been. It could have been for any of the strangers who decided in a quiet moment to believe that someone's life was worth more than the struggle they were drowning in. Keanu set the phone down in the passenger seat and leaned his head back, closing his eyes. The weight of the world always felt lighter when you realized you didn't have to carry it alone. That sometimes, somewhere, someone unknown had already placed a hand under your burden. He thought again of Jake, of Sister Marge, of every weary soul who kept showing up, dreaming quietly against impossible odds. Keanu smiled softly in the dark. He didn't need to know how the story would end for Jake and Emily. He only needed to trust that it would keep unfolding, fueled by the simple, stubborn grace of unseen kindness. Some second chances were written with grand gestures and loud declarations, but the ones that mattered most were written like this, in silence, in secret, and sometimes in the simple, unshakable act of believing. Keanu wasn't the type to leave a good thing half-finished. The envelope had been a spark, but he knew Jake needed more than a temporary reprieve. He needed a foundation, a real chance to build something lasting for himself and for Emily. The next morning, Keanu sat on the patio of a small cafe just outside town, sipping a strong cup of coffee as the sun climbed steadily into a pale blue sky. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for. Nathaniel Carter, old friend, former business partner, owner of a regional supply company that specialized in logistics and distribution. A good man. More importantly, a man who believed in giving people second chances. Keanu typed a short message explaining that he had encountered someone who was hardworking, trustworthy, and needed a stable opportunity, someone who didn't know he was being recommended. Nathaniel responded almost immediately. "Touch for him, that's all I need. Send him my way." Keanu smiled and leaned back in his chair. It wouldn't be a handout. Nathaniel's company was expanding. They needed reliable people. Jake would have to prove himself like anyone else, but the door would be open wider now, the first impossible hurdle quietly removed. Keanu spent the next hour working out the logistics. Nathaniel would arrange for a branch manager position to open in the town Jake lived in. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would offer flexible hours, full benefits, and enough pay to finally breathe without fear. Jake would be contacted through a local recruiter, offered the chance to apply without ever knowing who had placed his name at the top of the consideration list. No strings attached, no expectations, only possibility. Keanu closed his phone and let out a slow, steady breath. One piece of the puzzle had shifted. Now, it was time for the next. Keanu wasn't finished yet. As he sipped the last of his coffee, he thought about Emily. Jake's strength was remarkable, but Keanu knew that the greatest gift you could give a parent wasn't just survival. It was hope for their children. He opened another message thread, this time reaching out to an old friend from a nonprofit organization he had quietly funded over the years. It specialized in offering scholarships to promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Without the heavy paperwork, without the need for public recognition. He explained Emily's situation carefully, without using names or identifying details. Right kid, huge heart, needs a school that will see her, not just pass her by. The response was quick and simple. "We have a spot at a nearby private academy, quiet financial assistance, full tuition, no spotlight." Keanu closed his eyes briefly, feeling a rare kind of satisfaction settle over him. It wasn't about lifting them out with fanfare. It was about giving them a ladder, quietly, and trusting them to climb it in their own time. He arranged for the school to reach out discreetly to Jake through a local community liaison. They would make it sound like part of a community scholarship initiative, a program Jake could apply to for Emily if he chose. No mention of Keanu. No camera crews. No headlines. Just doors swinging open where walls had once stood. He spent the next hour coordinating details, making sure everything would appear organic and natural. It had to feel like a path Jake found through his own effort, because he deserved that dignity. Because dignity was the difference between a rescue and a rebirth. And Keanu wasn't interested in saving anyone. He was interested in believing in them. By the time the arrangements were finished, the afternoon sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the cafes. Keanu tucked his phone away and sat quietly for a few minutes, watching a pair of children play with a soccer ball in the adjacent park. Their laughter floated across the warm air, unburdened, light. That was what he wanted for Jake and Emily. Not perfection, not riches, just the freedom to laugh without counting the cost. He knew that Jake would still have to make hard choices, that Emily would still face challenges in a world that wasn't always kind. But now, there would be space between the struggle and the survival. Room enough for dreams to grow instead of wither under the weight of daily fear. Keanu stood up, tossing a few bills on the table, and slid his hands into his jacket pockets as he walked back toward his car. There was no satisfaction in being a silent benefactor. There was only a deep, quiet joy. The kind that came from knowing you had nudged the world just slightly toward the good, without ever needing it to clap for you. Before he reached the corner, Keanu paused and looked back once at the small town, its streets humming with ordinary life. Somewhere a few blocks away, Jake was probably finishing another shift at the diner, maybe wondering about the strange opportunities that were starting to appear at his door. Somewhere close by, Emily might already be packing her books into a new backpack, unaware that a wider world was waiting for her. Keanu smiled softly. He would never step forward to explain. He would never claim the credit. He didn't need to. The real reward wasn't in being thanked. It was in knowing that good had been planted, silently and carefully, in soil that might have seemed barren to everyone else. He reached his car, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. As he pulled onto the quiet street, he let the moment settle deep inside him, carving out a place where memory and hope could live side by side. Behind the curtain of their lives, 1,000 invisible hands had steadied them, believed in them. Now Jake and Emily would stand taller, without ever knowing exactly why. And that was exactly the way it should be. Because the truest kindness didn't seek a name. It sought only to leave the world a little softer, a little brighter, and a little more beautiful than before. The letter came on a Thursday afternoon. Jake found it tucked among the usual stack of bills and advertisements in his battered mailbox. It was simple, just a white envelope with his name printed neatly on the front. Inside was a letter from a local supply company, offering him a management position he hadn't even known existed. At first, Jake thought it had to be a mistake. He reread the letter 3 times, trying to find the catch, the hidden clause that would reveal it wasn't real. But there was none. A solid salary, flexible hours, health benefits, a location close enough that he could still walk Emily to school in the mornings if he wanted to. Jake sat on the front steps of their small rental house, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Emily plopped down beside him, her knees dusty from playing outside. "What's that, Daddy?" she asked, peering at the paper curiously. Jake hesitated. "It might be a new job," he said slowly, like the words were foreign on his tongue. Emily's face lit up instantly. She threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him over. "That's amazing," she squealed, squeezing him tight. "You're going to be the best." Jake laughed, a real laugh that startled him with its brightness. He hadn't realized how heavy doubt had been sitting on his chest until that moment. For weeks after finding the envelope in the diner, he had lived with one foot still stuck in fear. Fear that it was a mistake. Fear that if he reached too far, everything would crumble again. But looking into Emily's wide, hopeful eyes, he felt something shift. Maybe it was time to believe. Maybe it was time to step forward, even if his knees still shook. He hugged her back tightly, feeling the truth of it settle deep into his bones. For her, he would try. For her, he would dare to believe in a future again. The first few weeks were harder than Jake expected. Even after he accepted the job, there were moments when doubt gnawed at him. Moments when he stared at the company's front doors, clutching his new ID badge in sweating hands, wondering if he truly belonged here. He worried he would make a mistake. He worried he would somehow disappoint the people who had taken a chance on him. But every morning when he woke up and made breakfast for Emily, and every evening when he tucked her into bed with stories about the big, important work he was doing, her excitement gave him strength. Jake discovered that the new job wasn't just a paycheck. It was dignity. It was the feeling of handing Emily a permission slip for a school trip without having to silently calculate whether they could afford it. It was walking into a grocery store and buying fresh fruit without flinching at the price tags. It was seeing his daughter's face when he surprised her with a small ice cream after dinner, just because he could. Slowly, carefully, Jake began to trust that the ground under his feet wasn't about to give way. He learned the rhythms of his new work, managing deliveries, coordinating schedules, problem-solving issues before they became problems. His coworkers respected him for his quiet steadiness, his refusal to complain, his way of listening carefully before he spoke. Jake realized that all the years he thought had broken him had actually shaped him into someone stronger than he had known. Each scar had taught him patience. Each disappointment had taught him persistence. Each lonely night had taught him the priceless value of compassion. And now, all those lessons were building something better, not just for him, but for Emily. He hadn't saved himself by pulling some miracle from the sky. He had saved himself by showing up, every day, even when it was hard. And now, life was beginning to show up for him, too. A few months later, Jake and Emily moved into their new apartment. It wasn't big, just 2 bedrooms and a small living room with worn carpet and sun-faded curtains. But it was clean, safe, and close enough to Emily's new school that they could walk there together every morning. The first night they slept there, Jake stood in the doorway of Emily's new room and watched her arrange her few precious belongings with a seriousness that made his chest ache. She lined up her favorite stuffed animals on the bed, pinned her colorful drawings to the wall with tape, and placed the picture of her and Jake, one she had insisted they take at the county fair, right beside the lamp on her nightstand. Emily bounced onto the mattress, testing it with a delighted squeal. Jake laughed and crossed the room, sitting on the edge of the bed. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Like it?" he asked, voice rougher than he intended. "I love it," she said instantly, throwing her arms around his neck. "It's perfect." Jake closed his eyes for a moment, breathing her in, the weight of the years lifting a little more with each passing second. Perfect, not because it was fancy, not because it was flawless, but because it was theirs, because it was built on the quiet, stubborn hope that had carried them through every dark night. That evening, they celebrated with a picnic on the living room floor, peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and a bottle of store-brand lemonade Jake had splurged on at the grocery store. They laughed about nothing and everything, Emily telling silly jokes and Jake pretending to be shocked by each one. Later, after she drifted off to sleep, Jake sat by the window, looking out over the quiet town. He thought about all the nights he had doubted this moment would ever come, about the invisible hands that had helped carry him here. He didn't know who had left that envelope at the diner. He didn't know who had whispered his name into the right ears at the right time. But he knew that someone, somewhere, had believed in him. and that belief had changed everything. Jake smiled to himself, feeling something deep inside settle for the first time in years. The future wasn't just a distant wish anymore. It was here. It was now. It was possible. And tomorrow, he would keep building it, one small, stubborn, beautiful step at a time. A few months later, Keanu found himself driving quietly into the little town again. There was no official reason for his visit, no meetings, no events, just a quiet pull that brought him back to the place where a seed of hope had been planted, in silence. The town hadn't changed much. The same cracked sidewalks, the same blinking streetlights, the same mural half-faded on the wall by the post office. Keanu turned onto a narrow residential street lined with modest houses and tired apartment buildings. He parked at the far end, under the shade of a sprawling oak tree, and stepped out into the late afternoon sun. He kept his cap pulled low over his brow and his jacket zipped high. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see. From his spot in the shadows, he could make out a small apartment complex with peeling paint but sturdy walls. A patch of dry grass stretched out behind it, bordered by a few sagging fences and an old swing set that creaked whenever the wind caught it. And there, in the middle of that humble yard, Jake and Emily played. Jake stood with a baseball glove on one hand, laughing as he tossed a ball gently toward Emily. She caught it with both hands and let out a triumphant shout, spinning in a little circle before hurling it back toward him with all the strength her small arms could muster. Keanu watched, a slow smile spreading across his face. There was a lightness to them now that hadn't been there before. Jake looked stronger, his shoulders squared, his face open, unburdened by the crushing weight Keanu had seen that first night in the diner. Emily, too, had blossomed. Her hair bounced as she ran, her laughter ringing out across the empty yard like a bell. Keanu leaned against the rough bark of the oak tree, content to stay in the background, unnoticed. It was enough just to witness it, enough to see that the small acts planted months ago had taken root, enough to know that, even without credit, even without acknowledgement, the world had tilted just slightly closer to something good. He crossed his arms over his chest and stayed there, breathing in the cool, dusty air, feeling a rare kind of peace settle into him. From the shade of the tree, Keanu continued to watch the small scene unfold. Jake lobbed the ball high into the air, and Emily chased it with a burst of determined energy, her ponytail flying behind her. She missed the catch and tumbled into the grass, laughing so hard she could barely sit up. Jake rushed over, pretending to check her for injuries, dramatically inspecting her elbows and knees, while Emily giggled and squirmed away. Finally, he scooped her up and spun her in a slow circle, her laughter echoing across the quiet neighborhood. Keanu couldn't stop the smile tugging at his mouth. It's such a simple moment. And yet, it was everything. No grand houses, no shiny cars, no fancy vacations, just a father and daughter playing catch in a dusty yard, wrapped in a kind of joy that could not be bought or borrowed. It was the kind of happiness that came from the slow rebuilding of trust, of safety, of hope. Keanu watched as Jake set Emily down, ruffled her hair, and pointed toward the apartment. She nodded, sprinting toward the small porch where a cooler sat waiting. Jake followed more slowly, brushing dirt from his jeans, a lightness in his step that hadn't been there months before. Keanu shifted slightly against the tree, savoring the sight of it. He thought about how close Jake had probably come to giving up. How easy it would have been for bitterness to take root instead of hope. But somehow, against every odd, Jake had held on long enough for life to meet him halfway. And Emily had never stopped believing in her father. Maybe that was the secret, Keanu thought. Maybe all it took sometimes was one small push, one silent hand steadying you when the ground felt too unstable to trust. One whisper in the dark that said, "You're not alone." Keanu tucked his hands deeper into his jacket pockets and stayed hidden, knowing he would never approach them. They didn't need him now. They didn't need a savior. They had built their own sanctuary, and that was more beautiful than any thank you ever could be. As Jake and Emily disappeared into the apartment for dinner, the yard grew quiet again, the soft creak of the swing set swaying lazily in the evening breeze. Keanu stayed a moment longer under the oak tree, committing the image to memory. Not because he needed proof, but because moments like these were rare and precious, and he knew they were built out of hundreds of unseen sacrifices, small decisions, and stubborn acts of love. He turned away slowly, his boots crunching softly over the gravel as he made his way back toward his car. No one saw him leave. No one knew he had been there at all. And that was exactly the way he wanted it. Some stories were not meant to be told with words. Some victories were not meant to be claimed. Keanu walked past the empty playground, past the cracked sidewalks and the rusted fences, feeling the weight of the day settle gently into him like a well-worn coat. He didn't need acknowledgement. He didn't need applause. But it was enough to know that somewhere, a little girl was laughing, freely, without fear. And it was enough to know that somewhere, a father was standing taller because someone, somewhere, had once whispered, "You are seen." At the edge of the street, Keanu paused and looked back one last time. The windows of Jake and Emily's apartment glowed with soft light. Inside, he imagined them sharing a simple meal, telling stories about their day, maybe making plans for tomorrow. Keanu smiled, his heart full. He tipped his cap slightly, a silent farewell that no one would ever see, and slipped into his car. As he drove away under the early stars, the town faded behind him. But the hope he had witnessed tonight stayed. It traveled with him, a quiet reminder that the smallest, most invisible acts could sometimes change the entire course of a life, and that the truest measure of a gift wasn't in being remembered. It was in knowing you had left the world just a little softer, a little stronger, and a little more beautiful than before. The months that followed brought a quiet kind of blooming into Jake's life. His work at the supply company stabilized into a steady rhythm. He earned the trust of his supervisors, learned the ropes of managing a team, and found that the discipline he once thought was born only out of hardship became one of his greatest strengths. But something inside him stirred restlessly, a small voice that whispered there was still more he was meant to do. It started one evening when Jake noticed a boy, no older than 12, hanging around the supply docks after hours. The boy wasn't stealing or causing trouble, he just lingered, watching the workers load and unload crates with a sharp, hungry look in his eyes. Jake approached him gently, offered him a sandwich from his own lunchbox, and asked his name. Marcus. No father at home. Mother working 2 jobs. Falling behind in school. No place to go after dark except the streets. Jake recognized the look in Marcus's eyes because he had worn it once himself. A mixture of defiance and quiet desperation. He found himself sitting on the loading dock next to Marcus, talking not about big dreams or life lessons, but about simple things. Favorite sandwiches. Best superhero movies. Who could run faster in a foot race? By the time the sun set, Marcus was laughing. And Jake realized something. Maybe the second chance he had been given wasn't just meant for him. Maybe it was meant to be passed on. The next week, Jake made a few quiet calls. He asked the community center if they had space he could borrow one evening a week. He'd posted a small notice at the supply company and the diner, handwritten and taped to the walls, inviting any kids who needed a place to belong to come by on Thursdays after school. No fees, no forms, no questions asked. Just a space to breathe, to laugh, to be seen. At first, only Marcus showed up. Jake met him at the door with a high five and a bag of peanut butter sandwiches. They talked about everything and nothing, played old board games on a scratched table, and watched the way the afternoon light spilled through the dusty windows. By the second week, there were 3 kids. By the third, 5. Jake never lectured them. He never asked them why they came. He simply showed up, the same way someone once had for him without ever needing thanks. He brought books, games, sometimes a box of donuts when he could afford it. He taught them how to throw a baseball, how to fix a leaky faucet, how to read a job posting and believe, You might actually get the job. Emily started coming with him, her bright spirit pulling the shy kids out of their shells faster than Jake could have managed alone. She organized small art projects, encouraged them to share their drawings, their dreams, even their jokes. The small, bare room at the community center began to hum with life. It wasn't a formal program. There were no sign-in sheets, no official titles. But it was a bridge, a place where lost kids could find steady ground again. And Jake, without even realizing it, was rebuilding himself too. Word spread slowly but surely. By the start of the new season, the little group had nearly doubled. Teenagers who once hung around the edges of town now found their way to the community center after school, dragging skateboards and backpacks behind them. Some came for the snacks, some for the games, but most came for the feeling they couldn't find anywhere else. The feeling of being wanted. Jake made sure they all had a voice. If someone liked fixing bikes, he brought broken ones from the donation bins and let them tinker. If someone liked painting, he bought cheap canvases and let them cover the walls in color. If someone just needed to sit in silence and not be judged, he made space for that too. Emily thrived right alongside them. She set up small reading corners, taught the younger kids how to make friendship bracelets, organized birthday surprises with cupcakes and cards for kids who had never had a real birthday party. No one said it out loud, but Jake could feel it growing stronger with every gathering. A current, a pulse, a community. One Thursday evening, as he was sweeping up crumbs from the floor after the last kid had left, Jake paused by the doorway. He looked out across the small, messy room, papers scattered, crayons broken, laughter still echoing faintly in the air, and realized something simple but profound. The second chance he had been given had not just rebuilt his life. It had multiplied. It had created something unstoppable, something that needed no applause, something that would ripple outward, kid by kid, smile by smile, changing the world in ways he might never even see. Jake turned off the lights and locked the door behind him, the keys heavy and sure in his hand. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The bridge was built now, strong and steady, and tomorrow they would cross it again, together. It happened on one of those quiet nights when the world felt suspended, as if holding its breath. Emily had gone to bed hours ago, her laughter still faintly echoing in the corners of their small apartment. The dishes were washed, the floor swept, the lights dimmed low. Jake sat alone at the kitchen table, an old, worn notebook open in front of him. It was the same notebook he had once carried everywhere, the one filled with sketches of tire swings and backyard gardens and dreams he had been too scared to say out loud. Now, the pages were different. Some were filled with plans for the youth group, ideas for weekend activities, notes about each kid, scribbled with care. But tonight, Jake didn't reach for a clean page. He flipped to the very first blank one, the one he had always saved, maybe without even knowing why. He stared at it for a long time, the pen heavy in his hand. Then, slowly, he began to write. To the stranger who believed in me, he scrawled at the top. He hesitated, then let the words come. He wrote about the night he had found the envelope under the coffee cup, about the way it had shattered something inside him, not in a way that broke him, but in a way that let light flood into places that had been dark for too long. He wrote about the job he had never dared to hope for, about the apartment where Emily had her own bed and her own room and her own small window to dream out of, about the kids at the community center who now had a place to laugh and grow and be seen. He wrote about the ripple effect, the way one quiet act had changed not just his life but so many others. Jake's hand shook slightly as he wrote, but he didn't stop. He poured it all onto the page, the gratitude, the disbelief, the stubborn, fierce determination to honor the gift he had been given. He wrote until the words blurred with the tears he didn't bother to wipe away. When Jake finished the letter, he sat back in his chair, the pen slipping from his fingers onto the table. The apartment around him was still, the only sound the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. He reread the words he had written, feeling both lighter and heavier at once. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. He glanced toward the small bookshelf near the window, where Emily had placed a row of their favorite library books, and smiled to himself. The letter didn't need to be sent. It didn't need a stamp or an address. The right person, wherever they were, already knew. Jake folded the letter carefully, pressing the creases down with the palm of his hand. He slipped it between the pages of his old notebook, the same notebook he had once clung to like a lifeline. He closed the cover and set the notebook back on the shelf, tucked between two well-loved stories. Then he sat there for a long while, breathing in the silence, letting gratitude fill the spaces inside him that had once been occupied by fear. He thought about the invisible hands that had lifted him when he had been too tired to lift himself. He thought about the kindness that had expected nothing in return, but had given him everything. Sequined, and he promised, silently, that he would keep passing it forward for as long as he had breath to do so. Not with grand gestures, not with loud announcements, but with small, steady acts of faith, just like someone once had for him. The next morning, the notebook sat untouched on the shelf. Jake packed Emily's lunch, helped her lace up her sneakers, and walked her to school, the way they always did now. The seasons were shifting again. The trees lining the streets had started to blush with the first hints of autumn, and the morning air carried a sharpness that made everything feel new and possible. Emily skipped ahead of him on the sidewalk, her backpack bouncing with every step. Jake watched her, his heart full to the brim with a quiet kind of pride. He thought about the man who had once sat alone in a diner, feeling invisible. He thought about the weight of hopelessness he had carried for so long, so heavily, he hadn't even noticed how much it had bent him over. And he thought about the stranger, whoever they had been, who had chosen to believe in him without ever asking for anything in return. Jake knew he would never find them. He knew he would never get to say the words out loud. But somehow, he also knew it didn't matter. Kindness, real kindness, didn't need recognition. It didn't require repayment. It was its own echo, moving through the world quietly, relentlessly, unstoppable once it had been released. Jake tightened his scarf around his neck and smiled as Emily turned and waved from the school steps, her smile as bright as the morning sun. He waved back and stood there for a moment longer, memorizing the simple beauty of it all, the life they had built, the hope that had taken root, the invisible hands that had guided him here, steady and sure, asking for nothing but silently shaping everything. Jake tucked his hands into his jacket pockets and turned to walk home, the crisp morning wind at his back, carrying him forward. Behind him, the echoes of kindness lingered, unseen but deeply, stubbornly real. And ahead of him, the road was wide open. The years passed like pages turning in a beloved book. Emily grew, and with her grew a quiet, steady confidence that made Jake's chest swell every time he watched her cross a room or stand up for someone smaller than herself. She carried within her the echoes of every kindness she had ever been given, every quiet sacrifice she had witnessed, and she carried the fierce determination of a girl who knew exactly what love looked like, not in grand declarations, but in the everyday. When Emily entered high school, she joined a program that encouraged students to create projects honoring unseen heroes in their lives and communities. Jake had heard about the assignment, but he hadn't thought much of it. He figured she would pick someone obvious, maybe one of her teachers, maybe Sister Marge, who still baked cupcakes for the community center gatherings whenever she could. What he didn't expect was the invitation, the one that came tucked into a worn folder, handed to him one evening with a shy smile. "Dad," Emily said, shifting nervously, "there's an awards assembly next week. I'm supposed to bring my—" Jake blinked. "You want me to come?" he asked, voice catching slightly. Emily laughed and hugged him tight. "I wouldn't be there without you." Jake swallowed hard and nodded, tucking the invitation into his pocket like it was something fragile and precious. He didn't ask any more questions. He didn't need to. Whatever Emily had prepared, Whatever words she had written, he already knew it would be enough just to be there, standing quietly at the back of the room, witnessing her light shine. The day of the assembly arrived under a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Jake wore his best shirt, the one he saved for special occasions, and polished his shoes until they shone. Emily teased him gently about how nervous he looked, but her hand slipped into his on the walk to the school, grounding them both. The auditorium buzzed with energy, filled with proud parents, excited students, and the faint scent of polished wood and cafeteria coffee. Jake found a seat near the back, heart thudding in his chest, trying to disappear into the rows of folding chairs. He watched as Emily made her way onto the stage, holding a small, worn notebook in her hands. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped up to the podium, adjusting the microphone slightly. Jake's breath caught when he saw her unfold the familiar notebook, the same one he had tucked his dreams into years ago, the one he thought he had long since forgotten in the busyness of life. Emily smiled, a little shaky but brave, and began. "My project," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is about unseen heroes." The audience quieted, the soft rustle of programs and whispering parents fading into silence. Emily continued, her eyes scanning the room, but always finding her way back to Jake. "Some heroes don't wear capes. Some don't make the news. Some don't even know they're heroes at all." She paused, flipping to a page marked carefully with a torn piece of ribbon. "My hero," she said, voice thickening with emotion, "is my dad." Jake lowered his head for a moment, blinking rapidly. Emily went on, "Taught me that real strength isn't about being the loudest. It's about showing up even when it's hard. It's about believing in something better, even when life tells you not to." The audience sat rapt, drawn in by the quiet power of her words. She smiled again, the kind of smile that comes from carrying a lifetime of small moments stitched together into something unbreakable. "And there's something else," she said, glancing down at the notebook. "This story didn't start with us. It started with someone we never met." Jake looked up sharply, his heart pounding. Emily's voice softened, rich with feeling. "Someone believed in my dad when he needed it most. They didn't ask for thanks. They didn't wait to be noticed. They just planted hope where it could grow." Jake felt the room tilt slightly, the weight of years and gratitude settling around him like a familiar coat. "And because of that kindness," Emily said, "I'm standing here today." It was Emily's idea. One evening after the award ceremony had long passed and life had settled back into its quiet rhythms, she asked Jake if they could go back to the diner. "The old one," she said, her eyes bright. "Just for dinner. Just us." Jake hesitated for a moment, memories stirring in his chest like dust rising from an unopened book. He hadn't been back in years. Not since that night when a simple envelope tucked under a coffee cup had changed everything. But when he looked at Emily, so full of life and laughter, he knew there was only one answer. "Yeah," he said, smiling. "Let's go." They drove as the sun began to set, the sky painted in long strokes of orange and purple, the streets familiar and welcoming. When they pulled into the small parking lot, Jake's heart tightened. The diner looked different now. Fresh paint on the walls, new windows gleaming in the fading light. A few flower boxes lined the front steps, bright bursts of color against the soft grays of the building. But when he pushed open the door, the familiar jingle of the bell overhead made something deep inside him relax. The warmth was still there. The feeling that, no matter how long you had been away, you were always welcome back. They slipped into a booth by the window, the same one Jake had sat at all those years ago, and ordered simple meals. Burgers and fries, chocolate milkshakes thick enough to stand a spoon in. As they waited for their food, they talked easily, laughing over shared memories, old jokes, dreams for the future. The years between then and now seemed to fold away, leaving only this moment, perfect and golden. Jake looked around the diner and noticed small changes, the new counters, the polished floors. but the soul of the place remained untouched. And then he saw it. Mounted on the wall near their booth, small and unassuming, was a bronze plaque. He leaned closer to read it, the words catching at his throat. For those who believed, when belief was hardest. Jake sat back in his seat, blinking hard. He didn't know who had put it there. Maybe Sister Marge. Maybe someone else who had once needed this place the way he had. But it didn't matter. The message was enough. A silent nod to the unseen heroes. The quiet kindnesses. The small miracles that stitched broken lives back together. One humble act at a time. Jake looked at Emily, who was happily sketching something on a napkin, her laughter spilling into the air like music. And he knew, without a doubt, that every step, every hardship, every unknown hand that had ever helped him along the way had led them exactly here. Home. Their food arrived in steaming plates, and for a while there was nothing but the clatter of silverware and the comfortable hum of other diners enjoying their own small evenings. Jake bit into his burger and closed his eyes for a second, savoring the simple perfection of it. He and Emily traded fries back and forth, arguing playfully about which milkshake flavor was truly the best. It felt easy, in a way that life hadn't always allowed. Jake watched Emily, marveling at how far they had come. How hope, so fragile once, had woven itself into every corner of their lives without fanfare. There were no more late nights worrying if the lights would stay on. No more hollow spaces in the kitchen cupboards. No more fear choking the future before it had a chance to breathe. Instead, there was laughter, dreams, the plans, and the quiet knowledge that even the smallest kindness, even the smallest act of belief, could grow into something far larger than anyone imagined. Emily reached across the table, stealing another fry from Jake's plate with a mischievous grin. Jake shook his head, chuckling under his breath. He realized he didn't need to revisit every painful memory tonight. The diner wasn't a place of sadness anymore. It was a place of beginnings, of second chances, of quiet promises, fulfilled in the slow, patient way only real healing could bring. Jake let himself lean back against the booth, absorbing it all, the smells of frying onions, the clinking of dishes, the warm chatter around him. He wasn't that broken man sitting alone anymore. He was a father, a builder, a bridge for others, just like someone had once been for him. And all around him, life moved on, steady and good, unnoticed by the world, but seen fully by those who needed it most. As the last of their meal disappeared, Emily slid her napkin sketch across the table toward Jake. It was a rough drawing, done in quick, playful strokes, but Jake recognized it instantly. Two stick figures stood under a big oak tree, one handing a tiny glowing star to the other. Underneath, in Emily's careful handwriting, were the words, "Pass it on." Jake blinked, the lump rising in his throat too thick for words. Emily grinned, a little sheepishly, then shrugged like it was nothing. "I thought maybe we could frame it," she said. "Put it up at the center." Jake reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it once. "I think that's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Outside, the sky had deepened to a velvet blue, stars beginning to prick through the darkness, one by one. The diner lights reflected warmly in the windows, casting their small booth in a gentle golden glow. Jake turned once more to look at the plaque by the window. For those who believed, when belief was hardest. He thought about the people who had shaped his journey, the ones he had met and the ones he hadn't. He thought about Keanu, though he would never know it had been him. He thought about every silent act of grace that had stacked, one on top of another, until a bridge strong enough to carry them forward had been built beneath their feet. Jake looked at Emily, who was now scribbling a note on the back of her napkin sketch. "Leave a light for the next traveler." He smiled and leaned back, feeling peace settle over him like a well-worn coat. They didn't need to chase the past anymore. They didn't even need to understand all the hands that had lifted them. All they needed to do was carry the light forward. Jake signaled for the check, slipping a few extra bills under the salt shaker when Emily wasn't looking. It wasn't about paying back what had been given. It was about planting the next seed. They bundled up and stepped into the cool night, the stars stretching wide overhead, the diner's soft hum fading behind them. Jake glanced down at Emily as they walked, her laughter trailing on the wind. And he knew, deep in the marrow of his bones, that kindness wasn't a single act. It was a river, winding through generations, carrying those willing to believe. Tonight, they were part of that river. And tomorrow, someone else would be too. The road stretched long and empty as Keanu's car rolled into the little town one final time. He wasn't supposed to be here. His schedule had him booked 100 miles away, in a different place, for a different cause. But something had pulled at him as he passed the exit. A whisper at the edge of his mind. A feeling that some journeys are not complete until you see how the seeds you planted grew without you. He pulled off into a quiet side street, parking beneath the familiar old oak tree. The branches, now heavier and broader than he remembered, reached out across the pavement, like arms guarding the little diner beyond. Keanu stepped out into the cool night air, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The town looked much the same. A few new stores lined the main street, but the heart of it was unchanged. The worn bricks, the glowing windows, the sleepy hum of life settling down for the evening. He walked slowly, blending into the shadows, making his way toward the diner. As he approached, he spotted the familiar outline through the big front window. Jake and Emily sat at a corner booth, 2 slices of pie between them, laughing at something only they understood. Emily was taller now, her features sharper with age, but her spirit was unmistakable, the same bright spark he had glimpsed years ago when she colored quietly in the back of a tired diner. Jake looked older too, the lines around his eyes deeper, but there was something in his face now that had not been there before. Light, peace, a kind of quiet pride that could not be taken away. Keanu stood under the awning across the street, watching them through the glass, unseen. It was better this way. The story wasn't his to finish. It never had been. It belonged to Jake and Emily now, and to the future they were building with every laugh, every small kindness, every ordinary miracle. Keanu leaned against the post just outside the glow of the diner lights, letting the moment unfold without interference. He watched as Jake slid a second slice of pie onto Emily's plate with a mock-serious face, pretending to steal a bite for himself before handing it over. Emily rolled her eyes and laughed, nudging him back across the table with a playful shove. Their laughter filled the small diner, warm and light, rising above the quiet clinking of forks and the soft hum of the jukebox in the corner. Keanu's chest tightened at the sight, not with sadness, with something deeper. Satisfaction, gratitude, the knowledge that some gifts, once given, ripple outward in ways too vast to measure. He thought back to that first night, so many years ago, when he had tucked an envelope under a coffee cup and slipped away into the night without waiting to be seen. He had not known then what would happen. He had only known what needed to be done. Now, standing here in the cool evening air, he could see the full arc of it. The boy who once carried dreams too fragile to speak aloud, now a man anchoring a daughter's dreams instead. And it was enough. It was more than enough. Keanu shifted his weight slightly, pulling his cap lower over his forehead as 2 teenage boys burst out of the diner doors, laughing and jostling each other on their way to the parking lot. Neither noticed him. No one inside noticed him either. The world moved on, as it should. The miracle lived quietly, stitched into the fabric of lives that had gone on growing long after he had stepped away. Keanu smiled softly to himself, feeling the tug of the road calling him forward again. But not before one last silent blessing, one last glance at the seeds that had taken root without ever needing to know the gardener's name. Keanu stepped forward just enough to catch one final glimpse through the diner window. Jake leaned back in the booth, his arms stretched along the backrest, smiling at something Emily said. Emily, animated and bright, talked with her hands, laughing so easily that it seemed impossible to imagine she had ever known struggle. They were safe now, rooted, flourishing in a way only those who had once been fragile could truly understand. Keanu touched the brim of his cap in a quiet gesture of respect, a farewell only he would know he had given. There was no need to enter, no need to explain who he was or why he had paused. Some stories were meant to remain unnamed. Some acts of kindness found their full meaning in never being connected back to the giver. He turned and walked slowly down the sidewalk, his boots making soft, scuffing sounds against the cracked pavement. Above him, the stars stretched wide and patient, the same stars that had watched him leave this town once before, carrying a hope he could only plant and pray would grow. Now he knew. It had grown, not in grand sweeping gestures, but in laughter over pie, in a daughter's bright dreams, in the steady strength of a father who had rebuilt his life, brick. Keanu didn't look back again. He didn't need to. The miracle had already happened. It lived now in the simple hum of a life well fought for, well loved, and quietly, stubbornly blooming. As he disappeared into the night, the diner lights behind him faded into a soft memory. And ahead, the road stretched wide and open, ready to carry him toward the next quiet story, waiting to be rewritten by unseen hands. Maybe you too carry a story like that. Maybe someone once reached into your life without asking for anything in return, offering a hand, a word, a small piece of light when everything felt dark. Maybe you are standing where you are today because of an unseen kindness, a moment so small it might have gone unnoticed by the world, but to you, it meant survival. It meant hope. It meant you mattered. We want to hear your story. Has an unseen kindness ever changed your path? Has someone's quiet belief lifted you in ways you could never repay? Share your incredible story below, because when we share these moments, we remind each other that goodness is still alive, that faith in one another still matters, that small acts, given freely, can change the course of a life forever. And if you have ever been the person offering that kindness, never doubt that it mattered, even if you never saw the full reach of it, even if no one ever thanked you, even if it felt invisible, because real miracles often are. And they live on in the laughter shared over a simple meal, in a letter tucked away in an old notebook, in a life rebuilt quietly and bravely. Stay with us for our next story. Keanu Reeves steps in when a boy is bullied at the park. What happens next will warm your heart. Until then, remember, sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones we see. They are the ones we live.